In 1953, a woman in Macon, Georgia, woke up every morning at 4:30 to feed 9 people before the sun came up. She did not own a cookbook. She did not own a toaster. She had a cast iron skillet, a sack of cornmeal, a jar of lard, and 2 hands that never once second guessed themselves. That woman is number 7 on this list. Number 14 used a can of fish that cost 19 cents and fed a family of 6. Number 18 disappeared because the syrup it required came from a harvest that no one holds anymore. Number 3 was cooked on a tool that most of your grandchildren would not even recognize. These 25 breakfasts were the backbone of Black mornings in the 1950s. Not brunch, not a spread, just fuel made from faith and flour. Now, I am not a doctor or a dietitian. This is not medical advice. This is memory. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 25 homemade soul food breakfasts from the 1950s that have completely disappeared. Number 25, cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. This was not a recipe. This was what your grandmother ate when she thought nobody was watching. A woman in Selma, Alabama, would take a leftover square of cornbread from the night before, crumble it into a tall glass of cold buttermilk, and eat it with a long spoon while standing at the kitchen counter. No plate, no fuss, just cornmeal and tang. In the 1950s, buttermilk was cheap. You could get a quart for less than 15 cents in most parts of the rural South. The cornbread was already made, already paid for. This was a breakfast that cost almost nothing and took less than a minute to prepare. Some women added a pinch of salt. Others added nothing at all. The cornbread soaked up the buttermilk and turned soft, almost like a pudding. Children in rural Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia grew up watching their grandmothers eat this standing at the sink before dawn. By the 1980s, it was gone from most kitchens. Your grandmother did not call it a recipe. She called it Tuesday, number 24, sweet, potato, and leftover pork. In Tuskegee, Alabama, in the 1950s, a study by the Department of Agriculture found that fat salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses were the staple foods in most Black households. So when there was a piece of pork left from supper, it did not get thrown away. A woman in rural Alabama would slice a cold sweet potato from the night before, fry it in the leftover pork grease alongside whatever scrap of meat remained, and serve it with a biscuit. That was breakfast. Sweet potatoes were everywhere in the South. They grew in the small plots that Black families kept behind their houses, the same way their ancestors had grown them for generations. The potato was free, the pork was already cooked, the grease was already in the pan. This was not leftovers, this was planning. And it was the kind of breakfast that disappeared when refrigerators got bigger and people started throwing food away. That used to be unthinkable. Number 23, tomato gravy over biscuits. If you grew up in the Deep South, you know that gravy did not always come from meat. A woman in rural Georgia in the early 1950s would fry a little bacon, pull it from the pan, then add flour and a can of stewed tomatoes to the drippings. She stirred it over heat until it thickened into a reddish gravy that she poured over split biscuits. This was one of those breakfasts that existed because of what a family did not have. If there was no sausage, no ham, no eggs, there was almost always a can of tomatoes and a little flour. The gravy had a tang to it, a slight sweetness from the tomatoes that made the biscuits taste like something more than bread. In parts of Mississippi, they called it red gravy. In parts of Florida, they called it poor man's gravy. Your grandmother probably did not call it anything. She just made it and set it on the table. That was enough. Number 22, buttermilk biscuits with cane syrup. In the 1950s, a lager cane syrup was a staple on Black breakfast tables across the South. Woman in Mobile, Alabama, would pull a pan of biscuits from the oven, split each one open, lay a pat of butter inside, and pour a ribbon of dark cane syrup over the top. That was the whole breakfast. Some mornings, just biscuits and syrup. The Alaga brand was so popular in black households that the company marketed directly to African American communities for decades. A bottle cost about 20 cents in 1955. The syrup was thick, dark, and had a deep sweetness that refined sugar could not match. Children soaked their biscuits until the bread was almost translucent. The syrup pooled on the plate and you used your finger to get the last of it. This was not poverty. This was simple. This was a woman turning flour and sweetness into something her children remembered for the rest of their lives. They were following a memory. Number 21, fried catfish for breakfast. In the 1950s, if you lived near a river or a creek in the rural South, you did not wait until supper to eat fish. A woman in the Mississippi Delta would take catfish her husband caught that morning, dredge it in seasoned cornmeal, and fry it in a cast iron skillet before the children woke up. Fried fish, grits, and a biscuit. That was a Saturday morning in a black household along the Yazoo River. The fish was free, the cornmeal was cheap, the grease was already in the pan from yesterday. In coastal South Carolina, black families did the same with whiting and croaker. In parts of Louisiana, it was perch. The fish changed with the water, but the method was the same everywhere. Roll it in cornmeal, get the oil hot, and fry it fast. By the time your children smelled it, it was already on the plate. That tradition faded as families moved north during the Great Migration. There were no creeks in Chicago. Number 20, crackling bread. This was cornbread with an attitude. A woman in Greenwood, Mississippi would render pork fat back until the solid pieces of fat turned golden and crunchy. Those crispy bits were called cracklings. She stirred them directly into her cornbread batter, poured the batter into a greased skillet, and baked it until the top was golden brown and the cracklings had melted just enough to leave pockets of salt and smoke inside the bread. This bread had a chew to it that regular cornbread did not. It had weight. It had flavor that came from an animal, not a bottle. The practice of using every part of the hog dated back generations, passed down from a time when black families were given only the parts that nobody else wanted. But those parts became the flavor. In the 1950s, you could find crackling bread on breakfast tables from Alabama to East Texas. By the 1990s, most people had stopped rendering their own fat. The cracklings disappeared. The bread went quiet. Number 19, liver and onions. Your grandmother did not eat this because she liked it. She ate it because she knew it was good for you. A woman in Anniston, Alabama would slice calf liver thin, soak it in milk for an hour to pull out the bitterness, then fry it alongside rings of yellow onion in a skillet with bacon grease. She served it for breakfast with grits and a biscuit. In the 1950s, liver was one of the cheapest cuts of meat at the butcher counter. You could buy a pound for 30 cents. Doctors in that era actually recommended liver for pregnant women and growing children because of its high iron content. Your grandmother did not know about iron. She just knew that when her children ate liver in the morning, they did not come home dizzy from the heat in the afternoon. She was a nutritionist before the word existed. And by the 1970s, when people decided that organ meat was not worth eating, they lost the cheapest, most powerful breakfast on the table. That cost them more than they knew. Number 18, sorghum syrup on hot cornbread. This was the breakfast that disappeared because the harvest it depended on does not happen anymore. In the 1950s, sorghum making was a community event across the rural Black South. Families would bring their tall sorghum cane stalks to a mill where a mule walked in circles to crush the stalks and press out the green juice. That juice was boiled slowly in a long, evaporating pan over a wood fire until it turned into a thick amber syrup with a flavor that no store-bought sweetener could match. A woman in Franklin County, North Carolina, would pour that syrup warm over a slab of cornbread for breakfast. It had a buttery depth to it, a slight sourness at the finish, and a sweetness that tasted like the earth it came from. Food historian Michael Twitty wrote that sorghum masters were often old black men, and that making sorghum was one of the few spaces where something close to community happened across racial lines in the rural South. But here is what nobody tells you about breakfasts like these. They were tied to a rhythm. Sorghum had to be harvested in October. It had to be pressed and boiled the same week. The syrup had to be stored in glass jars and rationed through the winter. That meant your breakfast in February depended on what your neighbors helped you do in October. When families moved to the cities during the Great Migration, they left the cane fields behind. They left the mule behind. They left the neighbors behind. And the syrup vanished from the breakfast table, not because people stopped wanting it, but because the world that made it no longer existed. You cannot buy that in a grocery store. You never could. Number 17, rice and gravy. In parts of Louisiana, South Carolina, and coastal Georgia, rice was not a side dish. It was the center of the plate. A woman in Beaufort, South Carolina, would cook a pot of white rice in the morning, ladle leftover gravy from the night before over the top, and call it breakfast. That was it. Rice and gravy, no egg, no meat, just starch and salt and whatever flavor the gravy carried from supper. The connection between black families and rice runs deep. Enslaved Africans from the rice-growing regions of West Africa were specifically brought to South Carolina because they knew how to cultivate the crop. That knowledge built the entire low country economy, and generations later, their descendants were still eating rice every single morning. The gravy might be beef drippings, it might be onion gravy, it might be nothing more than flour and water browned in a skillet. The rice held it all. That was the whole point. Number 16, pork brains and scrambled eggs. This one made you look twice. A woman in Tupelo, Mississippi, would open a can of pork brains in milk gravy, rinse them, chop them, and scramble them into eggs with salt and pepper. The texture was soft, almost creamy, and the taste was mild enough that children ate it without knowing what it was. In the 1950s, canned pork brains were a common item on grocery store shelves across the South. They cost almost nothing. A single can could stretch a few eggs into a meal for 4 people. This was arithmetic. This was survival. By the 1970s, cholesterol warnings started pushing organ meats off the American plate. By the 1990s, most grocery stores had stopped stocking canned brains altogether. But in the decades before that, this was a breakfast that kept families full until supper with ingredients that cost less than a quarter. Your grandmother did not waste a single part of the animal. That was not a choice. That was a principle. Number 15, fried apples with Fatback. In the fall, when the trees were heavy and the mornings were cool, this was the breakfast that made the kitchen smell like something sacred. A woman in Knoxville, Tennessee, would fry thin slices of Fatback until crisp, remove them from the pan, then add sliced apples directly into the hot pork fat. The apples turned soft and golden. The natural sugars caramelized against the salt of the fat, and the whole skillet smelled like autumn on a plate. She might add a pinch of cinnamon. She might add a spoonful of brown sugar. But most of the time, the apples and the fat were enough. This was a seasonal breakfast. It only happened when the apples came in, usually September or October in the Upper South. The rest of the year, you ate something else. And that is part of why it disappeared. People stopped eating with the seasons. They wanted apples in January. They got them from a store, but those apples did not taste like the ones from the tree your grandmother knew. Number 14, canned mackerel and eggs. This was the breakfast that cost 19 cents and fed a whole family. A woman in Savannah, Georgia, would open a can of mackerel, drain it, flake it with a fork, and scramble it into eggs with diced onion and black pepper. She fried the mixture in a skillet and served it on a plate with grits or a biscuit on the side. Canned mackerel was even cheaper than canned salmon in the 1950s. It had a stronger flavor, a fishier bite, but mixed into eggs, it mellowed out into something savory and filling. The can sat on the shelf for months. It required no refrigeration. It was protein that waited for you. This was a breakfast for the first of the month and the last of the month and every morning in between when the icebox was bare. Your grandmother did not choose canned fish because she liked it better than fresh. She chose it because it was always there. Number 13, hot water cornbread. There is nothing simpler on this list. A woman in Jackson, Mississippi would pour boiling water over cornmeal in a bowl, add a pinch of salt, stir it into a thick batter, then shape it into small patties with her hands and drop them into a skillet of hot oil. The outside fried crisp and golden. The inside stayed dense and warm. That was the whole recipe. Cornmeal, water, salt, and oil. 4 ingredients. No egg, no milk, no flour. This was the breakfast that existed before biscuits were affordable, before flour was cheap, before baking powder showed up in rural stores. Enslaved people had cooked cornbread this way for centuries, sometimes on a hoe blade held over a fire, sometimes on a flat stone. The 1950s version used a skillet, but the recipe had not changed in 200 years. You soaked your hot water cornbread in sorghum or cane syrup or molasses or just plain bacon grease. By the 2000s, this had disappeared from most breakfast tables. It was too simple, too plain, too much like the past. But that was the point. Number 12, smoked sausage and grits. Before the fancy shrimp and grits that restaurants charge $18 for, there was this. A woman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, would slice smoked sausage into thick coins, fry them in a skillet until the edges curled and browned, then serve them over a bowl of creamy grits with the rendered fat poured right on top. The sausage cost about 40 cents a link in the 1950s. The grits cost even less. 1 link of sausage sliced across could top 4 bowls of grits. That was 4 breakfasts for under $1. This was engineering. Think about what the food industry did to this meal. They took the grits and put them in a single-serve instant packet. They took the sausage and turned it into a frozen patty wrapped in plastic. They separated the ingredients, processed them, and sold each one back to you at 3 times the price. But in the 1950s, a black grandmother in Louisiana did not need the food industry. She needed a pot, a skillet, and 10 minutes. She could feed her family a hot breakfast every morning of the week for less than the cost of 1 box of cereal. That math was not accidental. That was how she kept everyone alive, and the meal was better than anything you could buy in a package because it was made in a kitchen that smelled like smoke and butter and someone who knew your name. Number 11, stewed tomatoes over rice. This was a breakfast most people outside the South have never heard of. A woman in Orangeburg, South Carolina, would heat a can of stewed tomatoes in a saucepan, add a spoonful of sugar and a pinch of salt, and pour the warm tomatoes over a plate of steamed rice. That was the meal. Some women added a little butter. Others crumbled day-old biscuit into the mixture. The sweetness of the tomatoes against the starch of the rice made a breakfast that was surprisingly filling. This was a pantry breakfast. Everything came from the shelf. The rice was already cooked from the night before. The tomatoes came in a can that cost a dime. When there was nothing fresh in the house, there was always this. It disappeared because it looked plain. It looked like nothing, but it tasted like a kitchen where somebody cared enough to make sure you did not leave the house hungry. That mattered. Number 10, fried salt pork, Strico lean. This was the meat that built the South, and nobody talks about it anymore. A woman in Durham, North Carolina, would take a slab of salt-cured pork, soak it in milk for an hour to draw out the brine, slice it thin, dredge it in flour, and fry it in a skillet until the edges were crisp and the fat turned translucent. She served it alongside eggs and biscuits. That was a working man's breakfast. Salt pork had been a staple in North Carolina since colonial times. It went by a dozen names: fatback, side meat, white bacon, Midland meat. The meat itself was mostly fat with a thin streak of lean running through it, which is where the name streak of lean came from. In the 1950s, it was one of the cheapest proteins you could buy. A piece of salt pork flavored everything it touched, from breakfast to a pot of greens. By the 1980s, doctors had declared war on pork fat, and streak of lean slowly vanished from the morning plate. Your grandmother never got the memo. Number 9, Blackstrap molasses on a split biscuit. This was the breakfast your grandmother's grandmother knew. A woman in Tuskegee, Alabama, would split a hot biscuit in half, lay a smear of butter on each side, then pour a slow circle of blackstrap molasses over the top until the bread turned dark and glossy. Blackstrap molasses was the last boiling of sugar cane juice, the darkest and most bitter of the 3 grades, and it was the cheapest sweetener available to black families in the rural South. A Department of Agriculture study in the 1890s found that fat salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses were the 3 staple foods in black households around Tuskegee. 60 years later, in the 1950s, that had barely changed. Molasses was still there on the breakfast table. The flavor was strong and earthy, almost medicinal. Children who grew up eating it either loved it or learned to love it because there was nothing else sweet in the house. When refined sugar became cheap, molasses lost its place. But it had carried generations. Number 8, sweet potato biscuits. These biscuits were the color of sunset. A woman in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, would mash a roasted sweet potato into her biscuit dough, working it in with her hands until the dough turned a soft orange. She rolled them out, cut them with a glass, and baked them in a wood-fired oven until they puffed up golden. The sweet potato made the biscuit softer, moister, and slightly sweeter than a regular buttermilk biscuit. It also stretched the flour. One sweet potato could add enough bulk to a batch of dough to make 6 extra biscuits. In the 1950s, North Carolina was already the largest sweet potato producer in the country, and black families grew them in their own gardens. The sweet potato was free. The flour was cheap. Your grandmother used everything she grew. These biscuits did not survive the convenience era. People wanted biscuits from a tube, from a can, from a freezer. Nobody wanted to mash a potato first. That was too much work for something beautiful. Number 7, fried cornmeal mush. This was the breakfast that required a full day of planning and vanished the morning after the woman who made it was gone. A woman in Macon, Georgia, would boil cornmeal in water the night before until it thickened into a dense porridge. She poured it into a bread pan and set it in the icebox overnight. In the morning, she turned the chilled block of mush out onto a board, sliced it into half-inch slabs, dredged each one in a little more cornmeal, and fried the slices in bacon grease until they were golden and crisp on the outside and soft like custard inside. She served them stacked on a plate with butter and sorghum syrup or cane syrup poured over the top. The mush soaked up the sweetness the way a sponge takes water. Children ate it with their hands. The whole plate cost less than a nickel. This is the breakfast that tells you everything about what we lost. The woman in Macon knew things about cornmeal that a recipe card could not hold. She knew how long to stir the pot before the mush was thick enough to set. She knew the exact amount of water by the way the cornmeal resisted the spoon. She knew that the slices had to be cold all the way through or they would fall apart in the pan. None of that was written down. All of it lived in her hands. When she passed, her daughter tried to make fried mush from a recipe she found in a church cookbook. The mush was too thin. It would not hold. The slices broke in the skillet. The daughter called her sister and said, "I do not know how Mama did it." And the sister said, "Nobody does." That was 1971. The mush never came back to that kitchen. Number 6, fatback and eggs. This was the meal that smelled like Monday. A woman in Albany, Georgia, would slice fatback thin, fry it until the edges curled and the fat turned golden, then crack eggs directly into the same skillet. The eggs cooked in the rendered pork fat, the whites crisping at the edges, the yolks still soft. She served it all on one plate with a biscuit on the side. Fatback was the fatty cut from the back of a hog, salt cured and shelf stable for months. You did not need a refrigerator to keep it. You did not need a special trip to the store. It sat in the pantry wrapped in cloth, ready whenever you were. In the 1950s, this was probably the most common weekday breakfast in Black homes across the rural South. It was fast, it was cheap, it was filling, and it was exactly the kind of breakfast that nutritionists would spend the next 50 years telling you not to eat. Your grandmother did not listen. She had people to feed. Number 5, biscuits and sawmill gravy. This was not restaurant food. This was a woman with a skillet and nothing else to work with. A woman in Decatur, Alabama, would fry a little ground pork or a few slices of bacon, leave the drippings in the pan, stir in flour until it turned golden, then slowly pour in milk while scraping the bottom of the skillet. The gravy thickened in minutes. She poured it over biscuits she had baked in a cast iron pan that had been in her kitchen for decades. The gravy got its name from the sawmill workers in Appalachia who ate it to survive long shifts. But in Black households across the South, it had a different name. Some called it white gravy. Some called it milk gravy. Some called it nothing at all. The ingredients were flour, milk, fat, salt, and pepper. That was it. 5 things. This breakfast held families together through the Depression, through the war years, through the decades when work was scarce and dignity was not optional. Your grandmother called it breakfast. Number 4, country ham with Redeye gravy. This was the breakfast that used leftover coffee and turned it into something your whole family talked about for generations. A woman in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, would fry a thick slice of dry-cured country ham in a skillet until the fat rendered and the meat browned at the edges. She pulled the ham out, then poured a cup of strong black coffee into the hot pan. The coffee hit the drippings and steamed. She scraped the bottom with a spoon, and in 2 minutes she had a thin, dark, salty gravy that she poured over the ham, over the grits, over the biscuits, over everything. The gravy got its name from the way it looked when you poured it into a bowl. The dark coffee sank to the bottom, and the reddish fat floated on top, forming something that looked like a red eye staring back at you. Country ham was heavily salted and cured, so the gravy was strong. It was not for timid eaters. It was a breakfast built for people who had work to do before the sun got high. And it disappeared because country ham became expensive and nobody saves leftover coffee anymore. That coffee used to mean something. Number 3, hoe cakes with syrup. This was the oldest breakfast on this list. A woman in Columbia, South Carolina, would mix cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, heat a skillet with lard, and drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan. The batter spread thin and fried into flat, crispy cakes with golden edges and a dense, grainy center. She stacked them on a plate and poured cane syrup or sorghum over the top. The name hoe cake comes from the story that enslaved people cooked these cakes on the flat blade of a garden hoe over an open fire. Whether that story is literally true or not, the meaning behind it is real. This was survival food: cornmeal, water, and heat. 3 things. In the 1950s, Black grandmothers were still making hoe cakes the same way their ancestors had made them for 200 years. Alaga cane syrup was the traditional pairing. Some women used molasses instead. The cakes were crisp on the outside, warm on the inside, and they filled you up for the cost of a handful of cornmeal. By your generation, pancake mix had replaced them. That was faster, but it was not the same. Number 2, grits with butter, before cheese grits, before shrimp and grits, before any chef in any city put a $20 price tag on a bowl of corn, there was this, just grits, just butter. A woman in Birmingham, Alabama would boil water, pour in stone ground grits, stir them slowly for 30 minutes, and finish them with a generous pat of butter, salt, and black pepper. She served them in a bowl, and the butter melted into a yellow pool in the center. That pool was the best part. You mixed it in slowly with your spoon, and every bite tasted like warm, creamy, salted corn. 3/4 of all the grits sold in this country are sold in the South in what people call the grits belt. Georgia declared grits its official prepared food in 2002. But none of that marketing existed in the 1950s. Grits were not a brand. They were not a trend. They were what you ate every single morning because a bag of grits cost almost nothing and fed your whole family for a week. That simplicity was the whole point. That was the beauty of it. Number 1, salmon croquettes. If there is one breakfast that every Black family in America can trace back to a grandmother, it is this one. A woman in Memphis, Tennessee would open a can of pink salmon, drain it, flake it with a fork, and remove the soft bones with her fingers. She mixed the fish with a beaten egg, diced onion, a little flour or cracker crumbs, salt, and black pepper, then shaped the mixture into flat patties and fried them in a skillet until they were golden brown on each side. She served them with white rice and a biscuit, or with grits and a slice of tomato. In the 1950s, a can of salmon cost about 25 cents. It sat on the pantry shelf for months. It required no refrigeration. And in the hands of a woman who had been making these since she was 12 years old, it became a breakfast that tasted like it came from a restaurant. Toni Tipton Martin, in her cookbook Jubilee, traced salmon croquettes through 2 centuries of African American cooking. She found recipes from the 1930s Los Angeles Negro Culinary Art Club that rolled the patties in crushed cornflakes for extra crunch. During the Great Migration, Black families carried this recipe from the South to cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. The can of salmon traveled with them. The croquette recipe traveled in their hands. It was the last breakfast many grandmothers taught, and the first one most granddaughters forgot. And if you grew up in a Black household, the sound of salmon frying in a cast iron skillet on a Saturday morning is a sound you will hear in your memory for the rest of your life. That was home. Here's my challenge. Make one of these breakfasts this week. Just one. The salmon croquettes, the hoe cakes, the grits with nothing but butter and salt. Then sit down at the table. Not the couch, not your car, the table. Set a place, eat it slow, because these breakfasts were never just about calories. They were about making sure every person in the house left the kitchen fed and seen before the world got hold of them. There is a woman somewhere in your family tree who stood at a stove before dawn and made something out of cornmeal and determination that no restaurant could ever replicate. That knowledge does not have to disappear with her. You can be the one who asks. Tell me in the comments which one of these breakfasts your grandmother made. I want to know if the salmon croquettes get more love than the grits.
Field pea and rice hash turned a simple pot of peas into a hearty breakfast that fueled long days with ease. Black-eyed peas were simmered with onions, garlic, and a little smoked meat until tender, then spooned generously over steaming white rice. The flavors melded into a comforting bowl of earthy beans and fluffy grains that filled stomachs and lifted spirits. In the 1970s, this dish connected generations, recalling the Hoppin' John traditions of New Year's Day, while serving as an everyday morning staple in many African-American homes. Some families stirred in hot peppers for a gentle heat, while others finished with a drizzle of pepper vinegar for brightness. Field pea and rice hash proved that a few inexpensive ingredients could yield both nourishment and rich flavor, keeping families strong and satisfied. It celebrated agricultural roots and the creativity of cooks who understood that true comfort comes from a well-seasoned pot and the love shared around the breakfast table. Cane syrup biscuits were one of the sweetest ways families could begin a day when sugar was a luxury. Freshly baked biscuits were split open and drizzled with thick cane syrup, a cheaper sweetener that was widely available in the South. This breakfast offered comfort and energy, especially for children heading to school or adults preparing for long days of labor. Cane syrup added richness to otherwise plain bread, transforming simple biscuits into a treat. It was a dish tied directly to the land, since cane syrup came from local harvests and represented self-reliance. Families treasured it because it gave sweetness without breaking the budget, a rare indulgence during lean times. Cane syrup biscuits became more than breakfast. They were symbols of hope, resourcefulness, and the sweetness people clung to even in struggle. The dish carried both nourishment and spirit, helping fuel resilience during mornings that demanded strength. For many, it was the taste of home and perseverance. Redeye gravy and biscuits gave breakfast a bold, bitter soul. Born from ham drippings and black coffee, it was thin, smoky, and sharp enough to wake you faster than any alarm. Grandparents poured the hot coffee into the greasy skillet, scraping the bottom to gather every bit of flavor. The smell hit first, strong, dark, and unmistakable. Fresh biscuits soaked it up like sponges, turning bitter into savory beauty. It was a meal for workers, for those who rose before dawn and needed fire in their bellies. Redeye gravy did not pretend to be sweet or gentle. It was honest, intense, and unforgettable. Grandparents said it was a grown folks' breakfast, the kind that taught you to face the day head-on. The flavor was bold, a mix of smoke and bitterness that tasted like life itself, hard, sharp, but satisfying. Every bite carried stories of mornings spent in fields or factories, hands rough but hearts steady. It was more than a meal. It was morning courage in liquid form. Homemade sausage patties filled the house with a smell that felt like joy itself. Grandparents seasoned ground pork with sage, pepper, and salt, mixing it slow by hand. They shaped the meat into patties and laid them in a hot skillet, the sizzle echoing through the kitchen. The grease popped, the air thick with spice and smoke. Each patty browned perfectly, crisp on the edges, tender inside. Served beside biscuits or grits, they became the centerpiece of Christmas breakfast. The flavor was warm and full-bodied, carrying a balance of salt and heat that felt like comfort itself. These sausages didn't come from a store. They came from love, from knowledge passed down through generations. Families sat close, plates piled high, laughter ringing through the air. Homemade sausage patties weren't just breakfast. They were the sound and smell of home on Christmas morning. Fried mullet with hush puppies brought the flavor of coastal mornings to inland tables, celebrating the bounty of southern waters. Fresh mullet fillets were seasoned and lightly dredged in cornmeal before being fried to a crisp golden finish, their mild flesh staying tender and flaky. Alongside the fish, cornmeal hush puppies sizzled in the same hot oil, forming round fritters with a crunchy crust and soft, savory interior. The combination delivered a contrast of textures and tastes that spoke of seaside breakfasts and family gatherings. Some cooks added chopped onions or jalapenos to the hush puppies for an extra kick, while others served lemon wedges to brighten the fish. This meal reminded families of fishing trips, coastal traditions, and the joy of bringing fresh catch straight from net to skillet. Fried mullet with hush puppies honored African American ties to coastal communities and the creative spirit of cooks who turned fresh seafood and simple cornmeal into a feast worth waking up early for. Stewed prunes with grits might sound plain today, but it was a dish that kept households nourished and children strong. Prunes were affordable, dried, and easy to store, making them a reliable sweetener when sugar was limited. Simmered until soft and paired with steaming bowls of grits, they turned into a balanced meal of fiber, sweetness, and filling grains. Large families often leaned on this combination because it could stretch far with little cost. For children, stewed prunes made breakfast feel less plain, while adults valued the strength it provided for long workdays. It was also a dish that traveled through generations, passed down as a memory of lean years and perseverance. Families carried bowls of this simple breakfast before marches, school, and shifts, finding strength in the comfort of familiarity. Stewed prunes with grits became a quiet but powerful dish of the civil rights era, proving that even the humblest meals could carry dignity and hope. Fatback and grits was breakfast built on thrift and grit. The fatback sizzled in the skillet first, releasing its salty aroma as it browned and curled. The grease left behind became gold, seasoning the pot of bubbling grits to perfection. Stirred smooth, thick, and rich, the grits soaked up that savory flavor like a secret only the poor could afford to know. Grandparents served it in bowls, steaming and simple, with crispy bits of fatback on top. It was heavy in the best way, fuel for a long day of labor. There was pride in every bite, the kind of pride that came from making much out of little. Fatback and grits was not just breakfast, it was strength served with a spoon, a southern hymn sung over a hot stove. Sometimes a pat of margarine was dropped on top to melt into the heat, adding a layer of richness that made the bowl glisten. The meal was eaten slow, savoring every spoonful before the workday began. Grandparents said it was food that stuck to your ribs, and they were right. It kept you going long after sunrise. It tasted like memory and perseverance, like something deeper than hunger itself. Country ham and red-eye gravy brought a different kind of Christmas flavor, bold, smoky, and unforgettable. Grandparents fried thick slices of ham until the edges crisped, then poured in strong black coffee to make the gravy. The sizzle was sharp, the smell rich and salty with a whisper of bitterness. The gravy was thin, almost see-through, but it carried flavor strong enough to wake the soul. Poured over biscuits or grits, it turned breakfast into something fierce and proud. It was food for people who worked hard, who earned their rest on cold winter mornings. The taste of ham met the bite of coffee in a balance that only tradition could teach. It wasn't sweet or fancy, it was real. Country ham and red-eye gravy reminded everyone that even leftover meat could become something special when cooked with skill and care. It was strength served on a plate. Fried chicken neck with biscuits was another way families made use of overlooked cuts of poultry. Necks were cheap, flavorful, and could be fried crisp, then served alongside fresh biscuits for a sustaining breakfast. The meat was small but savory, and paired with biscuits, it created a meal that felt hearty despite its thrift. Families appreciated it because it ensured that no part of the bird was wasted, stretching poultry into multiple meals. Children remembered picking the meat from the bones, while adults valued the fat and flavor that carried into the biscuits. Fried chicken neck with biscuits was more than just food. It was an expression of resourcefulness. It provided both protein and comfort, fueling families for demanding days of work or marches. This dish symbolized resilience, showing how households turned scraps into sustenance without losing pride. Fried chicken neck with biscuits was a taste of perseverance, remembered as one of the breakfasts that carried people through struggle. Salmon croquettes with grits turned pantry staples into a breakfast feast that felt both luxurious and familiar across African American communities of the 1970s. Canned salmon was flaked into a bowl with onions, breadcrumbs, and a little seasoning, then shaped into neat patties ready for the skillet. As they fried, the croquettes developed a crisp golden crust while staying moist inside, their aroma mingling with the gentle steam of creamy stone-ground grits bubbling nearby. This pairing brought together the coastal traditions of the South and the practicality of modern kitchens, where canned fish kept well and stretched to feed a family. Some cooks added a squeeze of lemon or a pinch of cayenne for extra brightness and heat, while others folded in fresh herbs from backyard gardens. Served with a side of sliced tomatoes or greens, salmon croquettes with grits delivered protein, comfort, and a taste of heritage, showing how everyday ingredients could be elevated into a soulful breakfast worth savoring.
I want to know if anyone else had a woman in their kitchen who measured flour by the feel of it in her palm, because these are not just breakfasts. They are proof that the most powerful meals were never written down. They were carried in hands that knew things no recipe could teach.